So picture yourself waking up tomorrow morning and you're 4 feet tall, weighing about 60 pounds, and every single thing that exists wants to eat you. Not metaphorically, literally. Welcome to life as Homo habilis, where the average person died before hitting 12 years old. And that's if they were lucky. I'm not kidding. 12 years. Most kids today haven't even finished elementary school by then, and these guys were already dead. But here's what's insane. This wasn't some brief nightmare that our ancestors endured for a few thousand years. No, Homo habilis stumbled through this absolute horror show for 700,000 years. That's longer than our entire species has existed. And get this, new research from 2025 just dropped showing they were even more screwed than we thought. Turns out they weren't just struggling to survive, they were literally the favourite snack of leopards. Scientists used AI to analyse bite marks on their fossils, and boom, over 90% probability those marks came from leopard teeth, not hyenas like we used to think, leopards. Let me paint you the full picture of what made their lives so spectacularly terrible. First off, these guys were tiny. I mean, comically small for a human. The average Homo habilis stood maybe 3 feet 11 inches tall. That's shorter than your average 7-year-old today. Their bodies weighed about what a golden retriever weighs, except they didn't have the speed, the teeth, or the protective instincts of a dog. They had basically nothing going for them physically. No claws, no fangs, no armour, no speed, just soft flesh wrapped around fragile bones. And speaking of bones, here's something wild. When scientists examine Homo habilis skeletons, they find something disturbing. Their bones show they weren't built for running. They had these short, stubby legs and longer arms that were better suited for climbing trees than sprinting across open ground. But here's the problem. Their diet forced them out of those trees constantly. See, Homo habilis had developed this unfortunate taste for meat, not by choice, mind you. The climate was going absolutely haywire during their time, bouncing between wet and dry periods so violently that plant food became unreliable, so they turned to scavenging. Now, when I say scavenging, don't picture them casually picking at some leftover carcass. Picture this instead. You're barely 4 feet tall, you've got stone tools that are basically sharp rocks, and you need to steal meat from actual predators. Predators that could literally bite you in half. One group of researchers found that at best, and I mean absolute best case scenario, Homo habilis could maybe fight off a jackal, maybe a cheetah if they were really lucky, but that's it. Anything bigger? Game over. Speaking of game over, let's talk about what they were up against. The roster of predators hunting Homo habilis reads like a lineup from your worst nightmares. We're talking about over 30 different species that actively hunted them. 30, and these weren't your modern-day predators either. These were prehistoric monsters that make today's lions look like house cats. Take Meganterion, for example. This saber-toothed cat was supposedly only jaguar-sized, but don't let that fool you. This thing was built like a tank with legs like tree trunks. Its lower limbs were actually lion-sized despite its smaller body, giving it these massive paws equipped with recurved claws specifically designed to grab onto prey and never let go. But the real horror was its killing method. Sometimes it would go for the throat, sure, sinking those saber teeth into major arteries. But other times, and this is where it gets truly horrifying, it would actually engulf the entire head of its victim in its mouth. We have fossil evidence of this, a Homo habilis skull with puncture marks on the back of its head, but the angle shows the attack came from the front. This monster literally put a human head in its mouth like a grape. But wait, it gets worse. Meganterion wasn't even the biggest cat problem Homo habilis had. There was also Machaerodus, one of the largest cats to ever exist. Some species reached 893 pounds. That's bigger than a grizzly bear. And unlike bears, this thing was designed from the ground up to kill. It had these unique teeth with serrated edges that would wear down over time, meaning younger ones had basically biological saw blades in their mouths. Plus, despite its massive size, it was actually a good jumper, so climbing a tree to escape, not happening. Then you had Homotherium, another saber-tooth with a really special feature. Its teeth had these wavy serrations that created a bite that simultaneously punctured and sliced. Imagine getting bitten by something that's part knife, part drill. That's what Homo habilis dealt with on the regular. Oh, and Dinophilis was around too. That one specialised in hunting primates, so Homo habilis was basically its preferred menu item. The cats alone would have been enough to make life hell, but they were just the opening act. Next up were the hyenas, and I'm not talking about the laughing scavengers you see on nature documentaries. These were monsters. Pachycrocuta brevirostris was the largest bone-crushing carnivore that ever lived. It weighed as much as a lioness, but with jaws specifically designed to pulverize bones. Modern hyenas have a bite force of about 1100 psi. Pachycrocuta? We don't even have exact numbers because nothing alive today comes close to what this thing could do. Picture this for a second. You're a Homo habilis. You've managed to steal some meat from a carcass and you're trying to eat quickly before something notices you. Then you hear it. Not the laugh of modern hyenas, but something worse. The sound of bones being crushed like potato chips. That's Pachycrocuta showing up to claim your meal. And it's not alone. These things hunted in packs. A whole gang of lion-sized bone crushers that could digest literally everything. Skin, bones, teeth, nothing was wasted. Modern spotted hyenas can digest bone thanks to super-concentrated hydrochloric acid in their stomachs. Pachycrocuta had an even more powerful digestive system. But if you thought the giant hyena was bad, let me introduce you to Chasmoporthetes, the running hyena. This thing was built like a prehistoric cheetah. Long legs designed for extreme speed, a lighter build for endurance chasing. While Homo habilis could barely manage a pathetic jog with their stubby legs, Chasmoporthetes could run them down like a Formula One car chasing a bicycle. And they also hunted in packs. Imagine being chased by a dozen hyenas that can outrun anything you've ever seen. That's Tuesday for Homo habilis. Now here's where their life gets almost comically unfair. Remember how I said Homo habilis liked to scavenge? Well, they also had a thing for fish. They would wade into rivers and lakes using their hands to catch fish. No tools, no spears, just hands, which would be fine except for one tiny detail. The water was full of crocodiles, not just any crocodiles, monster crocodiles that make modern ones look like geckos. Crocodilus anthropophagus. The name literally means human eater. This thing grew to 25 feet long and weighed 1.5 tons. For comparison, the largest saltwater crocodile ever recorded was 20 feet and just over a ton. So Anthropophagus was bigger than the biggest crocodile alive today, and it specifically targeted humans. We have direct fossil evidence of this. 2 juvenile Homo habilis fossils were found with severe damage to their legs and feet matching the teeth of this exact crocodile. It would grab them by the legs during ambush attacks, then either drown them or use the death roll to literally rip their limbs off. Both of those juveniles had their limbs torn off. That's how they died. But Anthropophagus wasn't even the biggest crocodile around. That honour goes to Crocodilus thorbjarnasoni, which reached 26 feet long. This thing had a skull so broad it was specially adapted to crush armoured prey like turtles. Imagine what it could do to a soft little Homo habilis. Actually, we don't have to imagine. We have specimen OH7, the very first Homo habilis fossil ever found. Its leg bones have massive puncture wounds from a giant crocodile. But here's the kicker. The same skeleton also has different bite marks on its skull that match a leopard. This poor individual got attacked by a crocodile and a leopard. Whether it was at the same time or different occasions, we don't know. Either way, that's a spectacularly bad day. And we haven't even talked about the snakes yet. Now, we don't have direct fossil evidence of snake attacks on Homo habilis, but we know from modern studies that primates and snakes have been locked in an evolutionary arms race for millions of years. Some scientists think we developed our enhanced vision specifically to spot camouflaged snakes. Even today, snakes kill tens of thousands of people in Africa annually. Back then, with no anti-venom, no medical treatment, no knowledge of which snakes were dangerous, every snake encounter was potentially fatal. But here's what really gets me about Homo habilis. It wasn't just that predators hunted them, it's that their entire lifestyle basically delivered them to predators on a silver platter. Their diet of scavenged meat meant they had to approach fresh kills where predators were likely still hanging around. Their need for water brought them to rivers and lakes where crocodiles waited. Their small size meant they needed to forage constantly, exposing themselves to danger over and over again. And the climate wasn't helping. During the late Pliocene and early Pleistocene, Africa experienced massive environmental fluctuations. We're talking about dramatic shifts between wet and dry periods that happened on scales of thousands of years. Forests would turn to grasslands, then back to forests. Lakes would appear and disappear. Food sources that were reliable for generations would suddenly vanish. The latest research from 2022 shows these fluctuations were even more extreme than previously thought, with periods of intense aridification that would have made finding food nearly impossible. During the worst droughts, Homo habilis had no choice but to eat whatever they could find: tough roots that destroyed their teeth, carrion that had been rotting for days, bones that needed to be cracked open for marrow. Speaking of teeth, here's a fun fact. When scientists examine Homo habilis teeth, they find something shocking. By age 17, if they even lived that long, their teeth were absolutely destroyed. We're talking about dental wear that would be extreme for an 80-year-old human today. Cracked teeth, worn enamel, exposed nerves. And this wasn't from poor dental hygiene. This was from their diet, literally grinding their teeth down to nothing. One specimen, a 17-year-old, had teeth so damaged that researchers said it was twice as bad as what you'd see in a modern elderly person with terrible dental care. 17 years old today, that's a high school junior. Back then it was an old-timer with teeth ground down to painful nubs. No dentists, no painkillers, just constant agony every time they tried to eat. But perhaps the cruelest twist in the Homo habilis story is that they weren't alone. They shared their world with other human species who were basically better at everything. Homo ergaster showed up around the same time with bigger brains and better tools. Homo erectus was taller, stronger, and had fire. Homo rudolfensis had a larger brain capacity. Even Paranthropus boisei, which wasn't even in our direct lineage, was better adapted with powerful jaws for eating tough plants. Imagine being Homo habilis, struggling to crack open a bone with a rock and watching Homo erectus walk by with sophisticated stone tools and the ability to make fire. It would be like being stuck with a flip phone while everyone else has smartphones, except the stakes were life and death. The other species were getting bigger, smarter, better at hunting. Homo habilis, they stayed small, weak, and basically defenseless. New studies from 2025 using AI analysis suggest Homo habilis wasn't even the hunter we thought they might have been. They were pure prey. The researchers put it bluntly. Homo habilis could not cope with predation risks from even medium-sized carnivores like leopards. They weren't conquering the food chain. They were at the bottom of it, desperately trying not to become someone else's lunch. The research team, led by Manuel Dominguez Rodrigo, discovered that for years we've been getting it wrong. We pictured Homo habilis as these scrappy underdogs gradually working their way up the food chain, the first hunters, the first humans to stand up to predators. Turns out, nope. They were getting eaten just like the Australopithecines before them. Nothing had changed. They were still prey, just prey with slightly bigger brains and some sharp rocks. The study that revealed this used artificial intelligence to analyze tooth marks on Homo habilis fossils. Originally, scientists thought the marks came from hyenas scavenging the bodies after death, but the AI showed with over 90% certainty that the marks came from leopard attacks. Active hunting, not scavenging. These weren't Homo habilis dying of natural causes and then being eaten. They were being hunted down and killed. But here's the thing that really messes with your head about Homo habilis. Despite all of this, despite living in basically hell on Earth, they survived for 700,000 years. Our species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for 300,000 years. We're less than halfway to matching their record. How did they do it? How did a species that was basically a walking snack survive for that long? The answer might be in their group sizes. Researchers estimate Homo habilis lived in groups of 70 to 85 individuals. That's huge for early humans. Maybe that was their only defense, sheer numbers. Sure, the leopard might get one of them, but the rest could scatter. Sure, the crocodile might grab someone at the water's edge, but others could drink safely while it was distracted. It's a horrible survival strategy, but it was apparently enough. Some scientists think Homo habilis might have been the first humans to really care for their injured. We have fossils showing individuals who survived massive injuries that should have killed them, broken bones that healed, skulls that show evidence of surviving previous predator attacks. Maybe they looked after each other. Maybe while one Homo habilis was recovering from getting mauled by a leopard, the others brought them food. It's a nice thought, but it also means they were getting attacked so often that caring for the wounded became a necessary survival skill. There's also the possibility that Homo habilis had one advantage we're not considering. They might have been really good at hiding. With their small size and climbing abilities, maybe they could squeeze into places predators couldn't reach. Maybe they slept in trees, despite the risk of falling. Maybe they hid in caves, despite the risk of being cornered. Every choice was potentially fatal, but some choices were slightly less fatal than others. Okay, so we've established that Homo habilis had it rough, but now let's dive into the absolutely insane details of what made every single day a potential death sentence. Because when I say everything wanted to eat them, I mean everything had specifically evolved ways to hunt and kill them more efficiently. These predators weren't just dangerous, they were basically biological weapons designed by evolution to turn Homo habilis into lunch. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind about those saber-toothed cats. Recent research from 2024 analysed the bite mechanics of Meganterion and discovered something terrifying. Those saber teeth weren't just for show, they were precision instruments. The angle, the curve, the serrations, everything about them was optimized for one thing: severing the carotid artery and jugular vein simultaneously. One bite, 2 major blood vessels gone, unconsciousness in under 10 seconds, death in under 30. That's faster than it takes to microwave popcorn. But here's what's really messed up. Megantereon had this thing called a mandibular flange, basically a bony projection on its lower jaw that protected its saber teeth when its mouth was closed. This meant it could tackle prey violently without worrying about breaking its main weapons. It could literally slam into Homo habilis at full speed, knock them down with those lion-sized limbs, and not worry about damaging its teeth in the impact. Modern cats have to be careful. Megantereon could be reckless. And remember when I mentioned that Megantereon could put an entire head in its mouth? Well, new analysis of their skull structure shows their jaw could open to about 120 degrees. For comparison, a modern lion maxes out at about 65 degrees. Megantereon could literally unhinge its jaw like a snake, except instead of swallowing prey whole, it was creating a death cage of teeth around your skull. The pressure alone would crack bone, and that's before the teeth even penetrated. Scientists studying the Yanliang cave in China just found new Megantereon specimens from 2 million years ago, right in Homo habilis' time frame. These specimens show something interesting. They're smaller than other Megantereon fossils, which might sound like good news until you realize what it actually means. There were different sizes of Megantereon, possibly different species, which means Homo habilis wasn't dealing with one type of saber-toothed terror. They were dealing with multiple varieties, each potentially with its own hunting strategy. The smaller ones might have been faster, more agile, better at climbing. The larger ones were probably ambush predators that could take down bigger prey. Either way, Homo habilis was on the menu. And here's a fun detail from the research. Megantereon specifically caused carbon isotope changes in Homo habilis fossils. What does that mean in plain English? It means Megantereon ate so many Homo habilis that it literally changed their chemical signature. That's not occasional predation. That's a dietary staple. Now let's talk about Homotherium, because this saber-tooth had a party trick that made it extra special. Recent studies of its shoulder blades and leg bones show it was probably capable of short bursts of incredible speed, maybe 40 miles per hour. But here's the kicker, it also had the endurance to maintain a steady pace for long distances, so it could either ambush you with a lightning-fast attack or run you down over miles. Pick your poison. The teeth of Homotherium were particularly nasty. Those wavy serrations I mentioned, they've been analysed under electron microscopes, and they're basically nature's version of a serrated steak knife, except the serrations have serrations. It's serrations all the way down. This created a cutting surface that would cause massive tissue damage with minimal effort. One bite wouldn't just puncture, it would create multiple parallel cuts that would be almost impossible to heal from, even if by some miracle you escaped. But the real nightmare fuel comes from studying their social behaviour. Fossil sites in Europe and Asia show multiple Homotherium individuals together, suggesting they might have hunted in groups. Not full prides like lions, but maybe pairs or small family groups. So instead of one saber-toothed cat stalking you, imagine 2 or 3 coordinating their attack. One drives you toward the others. Classic ambush tactics that Homo habilis had basically zero defense against. Let's move on to the hyenas, because Pachyrhocuta's story gets even crazier when you dig into the details. This thing first appeared in Africa around 3 million years ago and spread across Europe and Asia. By the time Homo habilis was around, Pachyrhocuta had been perfecting its hunting techniques for 1 million years. It was an evolutionary success story, and Homo habilis was part of its success. Bone analysis from sites where Homo habilis and Pachyrhocuta coexisted shows something disturbing. The hyena wasn't just cracking open Homo habilis bones for marrow, it was doing it systematically. Certain bones were always broken in the same way, suggesting Pachyrhocuta had developed a specific technique for processing human remains. It had a routine: crack the femur first for the rich marrow, then the humerus, then smaller bones. It was basically following a recipe, and Homo habilis was the main ingredient. Computer modelling of Pachyrhacuta's jaw mechanics from 2022 revealed its bite force was probably around 40% stronger than modern spotted hyenas. We're talking about enough force to crack a bowling ball, but it wasn't just about raw power. The tooth arrangement was optimized for leverage, allowing it to apply maximum force with minimum effort. It could casually crack bones that would require modern hyenas several attempts. The really terrifying thing about Pachyrhacuta was its size variation. Fossils from different sites show some individuals were significantly larger than others, possibly representing sexual dimorphism or different populations adapted to local conditions. The biggest specimens would have stood almost 4 feet tall at the shoulder. That's eye level with Homo habilis. Imagine making eye contact with something that can bite through your skull like it's a hard-boiled egg. Now, Chasmoporthetes, the running hyena, that's a whole different flavour of nightmare. Recent analysis of its limb proportions shows it was more cheetah than hyena. Its legs were specifically adapted for cursorial hunting. That's the technical term for running down prey. Its spine was flexible, like a cheetah's, allowing it to extend its stride length dramatically. Modern hyenas can't do that. Chasmoporthetes was built for the chase. But here's what made it truly terrifying for Homo habilis. Isotope analysis of Chasmoporthetes fossils shows it was a hypercarnivore, meaning over 70% of its diet was meat. It wasn't an opportunistic scavenger like modern hyenas. It was an active hunter that needed fresh meat constantly. And with Homo habilis being slow, small, and basically defenseless, they were perfect targets. Studies of Chasmoporthetes kill sites show something interesting. The bones of prey animals are often found in groups, suggesting these hyenas would run down multiple animals in a single hunt. They wouldn't just catch one Homo habilis and call it a day. They'd keep going, picking off the slowest members of the group one by one until they had enough food cached to last several days. Alright, let's talk about the crocodiles, because the new research on these is absolutely mind-blowing. Crocodilus anthropophagus, the human eater, wasn't just big, it was specifically adapted to hunt hominins. The skull structure shows enlarged spaces for jaw muscles, particularly the muscles that control the sideways movement of the head. This is important because it suggests Anthropophagus specialized in the death roll even more than modern crocodiles. The death roll, if you're not familiar, is when a crocodile grabs onto prey and spins its entire body rapidly. This disorients the prey, drowns it if they're in water, and literally tears limbs off through centrifugal force. Modern crocodiles can do maybe 3 or 4 rotations. Based on the muscle attachment points, Anthropophagus could probably do 7 or 8. It could basically put Homo habilis in a lethal washing machine. But here's the really disturbing part. The tooth marks on Homo habilis fossils aren't random. They're concentrated on the lower legs and feet, suggesting Anthropophagus had developed a specific hunting strategy for humans. It would lie in wait at the water's edge, probably buried in mud with just its eyes showing, and grab Homo habilis by the ankle as they came to drink. The prey couldn't see it coming, couldn't run once grabbed, and couldn't fight back against something that weighed as much as a small car. Crocodilus thorbjarnasoni was even worse in some ways. New analysis from 2024 of its skull structure shows it had an unusually broad snout with reinforced bone around the tooth sockets. This wasn't for crushing turtle shells like scientists initially thought. This was an adaptation for dealing with struggling prey. The broad snout distributed the force of thrashing victims across more teeth, reducing the chance of losing a tooth during an attack. It could hold on to a fighting Homo habilis indefinitely without risk of injury to itself. The size estimates for Thorbjarnarsoni keep getting revised upward. The latest calculations based on skull proportions suggest some individuals might have reached 27 or even 28 feet. That's approaching the size of extinct marine crocodiles. But unlike marine crocodiles that had plenty of space, Thorbjarnarsoni lived in rivers and lakes, confined spaces where Homo habilis had no choice but to enter its territory to drink. Now here's something that doesn't get enough attention: the snakes. While we don't have direct fossil evidence of snake predation on Homo habilis, we have something almost as good. Genetic studies show that primates, including humans, have genes specifically related to snake detection that have been under strong selective pressure for millions of years. We literally evolved better vision partially to spot snakes. That only happens if snakes are killing enough of your species to affect evolution. Africa during the Pliocene and Pleistocene had pythons that would make modern ones look small. We're talking about snakes potentially 30 feet long, capable of constricting prey much larger than Homo habilis, but the constrictors were probably less of a threat than the venomous snakes. Africa has always been venomous snake central, and back then there were species we don't even have today. Every step through grass was potentially fatal. But you know what might have been worse than the predators? The competition, because Homo habilis wasn't just trying to avoid being eaten, they were trying to find food in a world where other human species were better at literally everything. Let's talk about Homo ergaster, who showed up around 2 million years ago, right in Homo habilis' backyard. Homo ergaster was basically Homo habilis version 2.0, bigger brain, about 900 cubic centimeters compared to habilis' 600, taller, averaging about 5'9" compared to habilis' 3'11", stronger with more robust bones and muscle attachments. It would be like trying to compete with your bigger, smarter, more athletic sibling, except the competition was for survival. Homo ergaster had a huge advantage: fire. They were probably the first human species to control fire, which meant they could cook food, making it easier to digest and extract nutrients. They could use fire to scare away predators. They could see at night. Meanwhile, Homo habilis was still eating raw meat and hiding in the dark, hoping nothing found them. But it gets worse. Homo ergaster also had the Acheulean toolkit. These weren't just sharp rocks like Homo habilis used. These were sophisticated tools: hand axes with carefully shaped edges, cleavers for butchering large animals, picks for digging. Homo habilis shows up to a carcass with the equivalent of a broken bottle, and Homo ergaster rolls up with a Swiss Army knife. The fossil record shows something telling. Sites where both species are found together show that Homo ergaster tools are associated with the meaty parts of animal skeletons. Homo habilis tools are found with the scraps. They weren't even competing for the same parts of the carcass. Homo habilis was literally getting the leftovers of the leftovers. Then there's Homo rudolfensis, another contemporary that was basically Homo habilis but better, bigger brain, up to 750 cubic centimeters, larger body size, more advanced teeth suggesting a more varied diet. Some scientists think rudolfensis might have been using tools that were previously attributed to habilis. Imagine thinking you invented something, only to find out your neighbor had been doing it better the whole time. But perhaps the most interesting competitor was Paranthropus boisei. Now, boisei wasn't on our direct evolutionary line, but they were around at the same time, and they had a completely different survival strategy. Instead of trying to eat meat and competing with predators, boisei evolved massive jaws and huge teeth for grinding plant material. They were basically vegetarian tanks. Paranthropus boisei's molars were 4 times the size of ours. Their jaw muscles were so powerful they had a sagittal crest, a ridge of bone running along the top of their skull just to anchor all that muscle. They could eat foods that would destroy Homo habilis' teeth. tough roots, hard seeds, fibrous plants. While Homo habilis was risking their life for scraps of meat, Boisé was calmly munching on plants that no one else could eat. The climate data makes this competition even more brutal. New studies from 2023 show that between 2.5 and 2 million years ago, Africa experienced rapid climate oscillations. We're talking about switches from forest to grassland and back every few thousand years. Each change would have favoured different species. Homo habilis, with their generalist approach, should have been adaptable, but they were generalists who were bad at everything. When forests expanded, the better climbers like Australopithecus sediba had the advantage. When grasslands dominated, the runners like Homo ergaster thrived. When times got tough and only the hardest foods were available, Paranthropus boisé's megajaws saved them. Homo habilis was always second best, no matter what the environment threw at them. The fossil record from Olduvai Gorge shows all these species overlapping for hundreds of thousands of years. They weren't replacing each other in a neat line like we used to think. They were all competing simultaneously. It would be like if Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and modern humans all lived in the same valley, except Homo habilis was the weakest of them all. New research from 2025 using advanced dating techniques shows this overlap was even longer than we thought. Homo habilis and Homo erectus coexisted for at least 500,000 years. 500,000 years of being the worst human species in your own neighbourhood. That's not evolution, gradually replacing one species with another. That's one species hanging on despite being outclassed in every way. The question isn't how Homo habilis went extinct. The question is how they lasted as long as they did. Every single odd was stacked against them. Weak bodies, small brains, primitive tools, surrounded by predators, outcompeted by other humans, living through climate chaos. By any reasonable measure, they should have been extinct within a few thousand years. But they weren't. They hung on for 700,000 years of pure hell, and that might be the most remarkable thing about them. Not that they were our ancestors, not that they used tools, but that they survived at all. They were evolution's ultimate underdogs. And somehow, against all logic, they made it work just long enough to pass the torch to the next generation of humans who would actually thrive. The evidence suggests they did it through sheer numbers and cooperation. Group sizes of 70 to 85 individuals weren't just for protection, they were information networks. If one Homo habilis found a fresh carcass, the group knew. If predators were spotted in an area, word spread. They might have been individually weak, but collectively they were a surveillance system that could track threats and opportunities across a huge territory. Some researchers think Homo habilis might have had the beginning of language, not full speech like we have, but maybe a complex system of calls and gestures that let them communicate danger, food locations, and basic social information. When you're the weakest thing in your environment, communication becomes your superpower. You can't fight a leopard, but you can tell your friends where the leopard is hunting today. You know what's crazy about Homo habilis? They didn't just have to worry about getting eaten every day, they also had to deal with their bodies literally falling apart from the inside out, because while they were dodging leopards and crocodiles, their teeth were rotting, their bones were breaking, and parasites were eating them alive from the inside. It's like nature decided that external threats weren't enough. Let's make everything about their existence painful. Let's start with their teeth, because this is where things get genuinely disturbing. By the time a Homo habilis reached the ripe old age of 10, their teeth were already showing severe wear. Not minor wear like you'd see from eating tough food occasionally. We're talking about enamel completely worn away, dentine exposed, nerves screaming in pain every time they tried to eat. And remember, most of them were dead by 12, so 10 years old was basically elderly. The worst case scientists have found is specimen OH16. This individual was about 17 years old when they died, which made them ancient by Homo habilis standards. Their teeth were so destroyed that researchers initially thought they were looking at someone in their 60s or 70s. The wear patterns show deep grooves, multiple fractures, and several teeth worn down to the gum line. This person spent their entire short life in constant dental agony. But here's what makes it even worse. The wear patterns tell us exactly what caused this. It wasn't just their diet of tough plants and raw meat. It was grit, sand, dirt, volcanic ash, all mixed into everything they ate. See, Homo habilis didn't have the luxury of washing their food. That freshly scavenged meat, covered in dirt from being dragged across the ground. Those roots they dug up, full of sand. Every single bite was like chewing sandpaper. Volcanic ash was particularly nasty. East Africa during this period was volcanically active, with regular eruptions coating everything in fine ash. This ash is basically microscopic glass shards, so Homo habilis was literally eating glass with every meal. The ash would embed itself in their food, in their water, in the air they breathed. Their teeth didn't stand a chance. And it wasn't just tooth wear. The fossil record shows massive amounts of dental disease, abscesses, infections, jawbone deterioration. One specimen shows evidence of a dental abscess that had eaten through the jawbone and into the sinus cavity. This person had an infection that spread from their tooth into their skull. No antibiotics, no dental surgery, just years of progressive infection eating away at their face. Modern studies on people without access to dental care show that dental infections can be fatal in about 12% of cases. The bacteria can enter the bloodstream and cause sepsis, or the infection can spread to the brain. For Homo habilis, with their compromised immune systems from malnutrition and constant stress, that percentage was probably much higher. Death by toothache wasn't just possible, it was common. But teeth were just the beginning of their health problems. Let's talk about parasites, because Homo habilis was basically a walking buffet for every parasite in Africa. We don't have direct evidence of soft tissue parasites, obviously, but we can infer from their lifestyle that they were absolutely infested. First, there were the intestinal parasites from eating raw meat. Tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, all setting up shop in their guts. These parasites don't just steal nutrients, they cause chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and severe anemia. For a species already struggling to get enough calories, having parasites steal what little nutrition they got was potentially fatal. Then there were the waterborne parasites. Remember how Homo habilis had to drink from rivers and lakes full of crocodiles? Well, those same water sources were also full of schistosomiasis, guinea worm, and various other horrors. Schistosomiasis causes organ damage and chronic pain. Guinea worm grows up to 3 feet long inside your body before painfully emerging through your skin, and these were the lucky parasites that didn't immediately kill you. The worst might have been the ectoparasites, lice, fleas, ticks, all carrying their own diseases. No fur to protect them like other primates, no clothing, no shelter. Homo habilis was basically naked and defenseless against every biting insect in Africa. And this was before mosquito nets, before repellents, before any way to avoid them. Every night was an all-you-can-eat buffet for bloodsuckers. Modern hunter-gatherers with basic tools and knowledge can somewhat control parasites through medicinal plants and behavioral adaptations. Homo habilis had none of that knowledge. They were the test subjects that future humans would learn from, assuming they survived long enough to pass on any information. Now let's talk about injuries, because the fossil record shows Homo habilis was constantly getting hurt. Broken bones, dislocated joints, skull fractures. One study found that over 40% of Homo habilis fossils show signs of healed injuries. Healed is the key word here. These weren't killing blows. These were injuries they survived and lived with, probably in constant pain. Specimen OH8, for example, shows a healed fracture of the tibia that didn't set properly. This individual broke their shin bone and it healed at an angle. They would have walked with a severe limp for the rest of their life, making them even slower and more vulnerable to predators. In a world where running from danger was already nearly impossible, having a permanent limp was basically a death sentence on installment plan. But here's something interesting. The fact that these injuries healed at all suggests some level of care from other group members. You can't hunt or gather with a broken leg. Someone had to bring you food and water. Someone had to protect you while you recovered. This might be the only heartwarming thing about Homo habilis. They cared for their injured, even when it put the whole group at risk. Falls were probably a major source of injuries. Remember, Homo habilis spent a lot of time in trees despite not being great climbers. Their fossil record shows features suited for both tree climbing and ground walking, but they weren't particularly good at either. They were evolutionary fence-sitters stuck between two worlds and mastering neither. Modern chimpanzees, who are much better climbers, still experience serious falls regularly. One study found that 50% of adult chimps showed evidence of healed fractures from falls. Homo habilis, with their less adapted climbing anatomy, probably fell even more often. And when you're only 4 feet tall and weigh 60 pounds, you don't have much margin for error. A fall that might bruise a modern human could shatter a Homo habilis's bones. Speaking of bones, let's talk about osteoporosis. Yeah, they had that too. Analysis of Homo habilis bone density shows that many individuals, especially females, had significantly reduced bone density. This was probably due to a combination of poor nutrition, specifically lack of calcium and vitamin D, and the stress of repeated pregnancies and nursing. Female Homo habilis had it particularly rough. They probably reached sexual maturity around 8 or 9 years old, started having babies immediately, and kept having them until they died, which was usually by their early teens. Their bodies never had a chance to fully develop before they were depleted by pregnancy. Imagine being pregnant at 9 years old with osteoporosis, dental disease, and parasites while trying to avoid being eaten by leopards. That was normal for female Homo habilis. The climate situation made everything worse. The late Pliocene and early Pleistocene saw some of the most dramatic climate swings in Earth's history. We're not talking about gradual changes over millions of years. These were rapid oscillations that could transform entire ecosystems in just a few thousand years. New climate data from 2023 shows that between 2.7 and 2.5 million years ago, right when Homo habilis appeared, Africa experienced what scientists call climate variability amplification. Basically, the weather went completely insane. Decades of drought followed by massive floods, temperatures swinging by 15 degrees Celsius between seasons, forests turning to deserts and back again. For Homo habilis, this meant that survival strategies that worked for your grandparents might kill you. That water source your group had relied on for generations, dried up. Those fruit trees you depended on, dead. The antelope herds you scavenged from, migrated hundreds of miles away. Every generation had to basically reinvent how to survive. The Olduvai Gorge, where many Homo habilis fossils were found, was particularly unstable. It was a lake that regularly appeared and disappeared based on climate. When it was full, it attracted animals and provided water. When it dried up, everything died or left. Homo habilis had to constantly adapt to these changes with their primitive tools and limited cognitive abilities. The volcanic activity I mentioned earlier wasn't just bad for their teeth. Major eruptions could devastate entire regions for years. The Toba supereruption happened after Homo habilis' time, but smaller eruptions were constant. Ash would block out the sun, killing plants. Acid rain would poison water sources. Pyroclastic flows would incinerate everything in their path. And Homo habilis had no way to predict or prepare for any of it. But volcanic soil, once it weathers, is incredibly fertile, so areas that were death zones one year might be lush paradise a few years later. This boom and bust cycle meant Homo habilis populations were constantly expanding and crashing. Good years might see populations double. Bad years might kill 90% of them. They were riding a demographic roller coaster with no safety harness. Diseases were another invisible killer. We don't have direct evidence of infectious diseases in Homo habilis, but we can make educated guesses based on their lifestyle. Living in large groups of 70 to 80 individuals meant any communicable disease would spread like wildfire. No understanding of hygiene, no quarantine procedures, no medicine beyond whatever their immune systems could muster. Tuberculosis was probably a major killer. It's been found in other prehistoric human populations and thrives in exactly the conditions Homo habilis lived in: crowded groups, poor nutrition, stress, and close contact with infected animals. TB doesn't kill quickly. It's a slow, wasting disease that gradually destroys your lungs. You become weaker, more susceptible to other infections, less able to contribute to the group. In a society where everyone needed to contribute to survive, a slow death by TB meant the whole group suffered. Malaria was definitely present. Africa has been malaria central for millions of years, and Homo habilis had no defense against it. No mosquito nets, no anti-malarial drugs, not even the sickle cell trait that some later human populations evolved. Every mosquito bite was potentially fatal, and in tropical Africa, mosquito bites were constant. But here's the real kicker about diseases. Homo habilis was probably patient zero for a lot of human diseases. They were the first humans to live in large groups, to eat significant amounts of meat, to have regular contact with predator kills. They were basically a laboratory for diseases to jump from animals to humans. When they scavenged from predator kills, they were exposed to whatever diseases those animals carried. When they ate raw meat, they ingested every pathogen in that meat. When they lived in close quarters, they created perfect conditions for diseases to mutate and spread. Every horrible disease that would plague humanity for the next 2 million years might have gotten its start in a Homo habilis group. The psychological stress must have been unbearable. Modern humans develop PTSD from single traumatic events. Homo habilis lived in constant trauma. Every day brought the real possibility of violent death. Every night was spent in darkness, surrounded by predators. Every meal could be your last. They couldn't even sleep properly, constantly waking to check for danger. Studies on modern populations living under chronic stress show increased rates of heart disease, immune system dysfunction, and cognitive impairment. Homo habilis lived under stress levels that would break modern humans in weeks. Their cortisol levels must have been through the roof constantly. Their bodies were in permanent fight or flight mode, which ironically made them worse at both fighting and fleeing. The effects on childhood development would have been severe. Modern children who experience chronic stress show reduced brain development, particularly in areas related to emotional regulation and decision-making. Homo habilis children, assuming they survived infancy, grew up in an environment of constant terror. Their brains were developing while marinated in stress hormones. This might explain why Homo habilis's brain, while larger than Australopithecines, didn't seem to give them much advantage. They had the hardware for intelligence, but were too stressed and malnourished for it to develop properly. It's like having a powerful computer, but running it on a failing battery while it's overheating. The potential was there, but the conditions prevented it from being realized. Malnutrition was chronic and severe. Homo habilis needed about 2,000 calories a day to survive, but probably averaged much less. Their diet was unpredictable and often nutritionally poor. Scavenged meat might be high in protein, but could be days old and partially rotted. Plant foods were seasonal and required significant energy to gather and process. The children suffered most from malnutrition. Growing brains need massive amounts of energy and specific nutrients. Omega-3 fatty acids for neural development, iron for oxygen transport, calcium for bone growth. Homo habilis children got none of these in adequate amounts. Their brains were trying to grow while literally starving. Evidence of this malnutrition shows up in their bones. Harris lines, horizontal lines in long bones that indicate periods of growth disruption, are common in Homo habilis fossils. These lines form when growth stops due to severe stress, usually malnutrition or disease. Most Homo habilis fossils show multiple Harris lines, meaning they experienced repeated periods where their bodies just stopped growing because they didn't have enough nutrients to continue. Let me blow your mind with something that shouldn't make sense. Homo habilis, despite being basically the universe's punching bag, somehow developed one of the most complex social structures of any early human species. They weren't just randomly wandering around getting eaten. They had systems, hierarchies, and survival strategies that were surprisingly sophisticated for creatures with brains the size of a softball. Groups of 70 to 85 individuals weren't just random numbers. That's bigger than most modern hunter-gatherer bands. Hell, it's bigger than some modern extended families. Managing that many individuals requires serious social organization. You need leaders, followers, specialists, caregivers. You need rules about who eats first, who gets the best sleeping spots, who makes decisions. Homo habilis had all of this, and they managed it with brains barely bigger than a chimps. Here's what's really wild. Based on studies of their skull anatomy, specifically the areas associated with speech production, some researchers think Homo habilis might have had basic language abilities. Not full speech like we have, but maybe something more complex than animal calls. The shape of their basic cranium, that's the bottom of the skull, shows features that in modern humans are associated with vocal control. They might have been able to produce a wider range of sounds than other apes. Why does this matter? Because in their hellscape of a world, communication was literally life or death. A specific call that meant leopard versus one that meant hyena could be the difference between climbing a tree or forming a defensive circle. A sound that meant fresh kill versus rotting carcass could save the group from food poisoning. They needed complex communication just to survive the average Tuesday. The fossil evidence suggests they had division of labour. Some individuals show wear patterns on their bones consistent with specific repetitive tasks. One might have been the tool maker, spending hours knapping stones. Another might have been the primary gatherer, with stress markers on their spine from constant bending. This isn't random activity. This is job specialisation, something we don't see clearly until much later in human evolution. Think about what that means. In a group where everyone is struggling to survive, they still recognize that some individuals were better at certain tasks. Maybe Grog was terrible at making tools but had eagle eyes for spotting predators, so Grog becomes the lookout while someone else makes the tools. That's advanced social thinking for a creature that could barely avoid being eaten. The care for injured individuals I mentioned earlier, that was revolutionary. In nature, injured animals usually die quickly. They can't hunt, can't flee, can't contribute. Most species abandon their injured, but Homo habilis didn't. We have multiple fossils showing individuals who survived injuries that would have been fatal without help. Someone with a broken femur who lived for months afterward, someone with a skull fracture who healed. These weren't accidents. This was deliberate care. But here's where it gets interesting. Caring for the injured is actually a terrible survival strategy in the short term. That injured individual is consuming resources without contributing. They're slowing down the group. They're potentially attracting predators with their weakness. Every logical calculation says you should abandon them. But Homo habilis didn't. And that might have been genius. See, in a world where anyone could be injured at any moment, knowing that your group would care for you if you got hurt changed everything. It meant individuals would take more risks for the group. You'd be more likely to be the one checking if that carcass was safe to approach, if you knew a broken leg wouldn't be a death sentence. It created a social safety net that encouraged beneficial risk-taking. The gender dynamics were probably complex too. Based on fossil evidence, male and female Homo habilis had significant size differences, what we call sexual dimorphism. Males were maybe 20 to 30% larger than females. In primates, this usually indicates competition between males for mating opportunities, but in Homo habilis' case, it might have served a different purpose. Larger males might have been the primary defenders against predators, not competitors for mates. When a leopard shows up, you want your biggest individuals forming the front line. The size difference might have been less about male competition and more about group defense specialization. Big males fight off threats. Smaller females with their lower caloric needs focus on gathering and childcare. Speaking of childcare, Homo habilis had a unique problem. Their babies were basically useless. I mean, all human babies are useless, but Homo habilis babies were especially vulnerable, born with bigger brains than Australopithecine babies, but still much smaller than adult brains. They needed extensive care for years. In a world where most individuals died by 12, spending 3 or 4 years raising each child was a massive investment. This probably led to alloparenting, where individuals other than the parents help raise children. Grandmothers, if any survived that long, older siblings, maybe even unrelated group members. It takes a village to raise a child became literal survival strategy. A mother couldn't gather food, watch for predators, and care for an infant simultaneously. She needed help, and the group provided it. But here's the brutal math. If females started having babies around age 9 and died around age 12 to 14, they might have 2, maybe 3 offspring maximum. With infant mortality probably over 60%, maybe 1 survived to adulthood. The entire species was balanced on a knife's edge demographically. 1 bad year, 1 disease outbreak, 1 particularly successful predator, and a whole population could disappear. This might explain why they lived in such large groups. It wasn't just protection from predators, it was demographic insurance. In a small group of 20 individuals, a few deaths could end the group. In a group of 80, you could lose 10 members and still be viable. It's horrible to think about, but Homo habilis groups might have calculated that they would lose a certain percentage of members each year and planned accordingly. Food sharing was probably mandatory, not optional. When you're scavenging, you might go days without finding anything, then suddenly stumble upon a fresh kill. If everyone kept what they found, most would starve. But if everything was shared, the group's luck averaged out. Today I find food and share it with you. Tomorrow you find food and share it with me. It's basic social insurance, but it requires trust and enforcement. This is where social hierarchies become important. Someone had to decide how food was distributed. Someone had to punish cheaters who didn't share. Someone had to organize group movements. We don't know exactly how Homo habilis organized their societies, but they must have had some system. Maybe the oldest individuals with their valuable knowledge of seasonal patterns and predator behavior, maybe the strongest who could enforce rules, maybe the best tool makers who everyone depended on. The knowledge transfer between generations was crucial but limited. With most individuals dying before their teens, there wasn't much time to pass on information. A young Homo habilis had maybe 5 or 6 years to learn everything about survival before they were on their own. Compare that to modern humans who might spend 20 years learning before full independence. Homo habilis children had to grow up fast or die. This compressed learning period might have selected for individuals who could learn quickly through observation rather than instruction, watch and copy rather than listen and understand. This might explain why their tool tradition, the older one, remained basically unchanged for nearly 1 million years. They were really good at copying exactly what they saw, but not at innovation or improvement. Speaking of tools, let's talk about what the older one toolkit actually meant for their survival. These weren't just sharp rocks. Each tool had a specific purpose. Choppers for breaking bones, flakes for cutting meat, hammerstones for cracking nuts, scrapers for processing hides. This isn't random bashing of rocks. This is technology, primitive but functional. Making these tools required forward planning. You couldn't just grab any rock. You needed specific types of stone, basalt for hammerstones, quartz or flint for cutting tools. These stones might not be available where you needed the tools, so Homo habilis had to carry rocks with them, sometimes for miles. That's planning ahead, understanding that future you will need something that present you has to provide. Tool making was probably a social activity. We find knapping sites where multiple individuals sat together making tools. This wasn't just efficient, it was educational. Young Homo habilis could watch experienced knappers, learn the techniques, understand which stones to choose. It was school, workshop, and social hour combined. But tools also created social problems. Who owned them? In a sharing society, were tools personal property or group resources? If I made a really good hand axe, was it mine or did I have to share it? These might seem like minor issues, but in a society where tools could mean the difference between eating and starving, ownership mattered. The interesting thing is, we don't find many Homo habilis tools with the fossils. The tools are often found separately from the bodies. This might mean they didn't carry tools constantly. Maybe they cached them at specific locations. You don't carry your tools to the dangerous waterhole. You leave them hidden nearby and retrieve them when needed. That's advanced planning most animals can't do. Territory was probably a fluid concept for Homo habilis. They couldn't defend territory like modern humans. They didn't have the weapons or numbers, but they probably had ranging patterns, areas they regularly visited based on seasonal resources. The group that knew where the fruit trees ripened in March and where the herds gathered in September had a survival advantage. But territories overlapped with other Homo habilis groups and other human species. What happened when two groups met? Violence? Trade? Avoidance? We don't know for sure, but given their weakness relative to other threats, Homo habilis groups might have been surprisingly peaceful with each other. Fighting another Homo habilis group meant risk of injury, and injury meant death. Better to share resources or avoid each other than fight. Intergroup mating was probably necessary for genetic diversity. With small population sizes, inbreeding would have been a constant threat. Young individuals might have transferred between groups, either voluntarily or through raids. This gene flow would have been essential for the species' long-term survival, but would have created social tensions. Imagine having to accept individuals from a competing group because you needed their genes. The most remarkable thing about Homo habilis society was its resilience. For 700,000 years, through climate catastrophes, predator attacks, diseases, competition from other species, they maintained complex social groups. Their society didn't collapse. It adapted, endured, survived. That's longer than any human civilization has lasted, longer than our species has existed. They did this without writing, without complex language, without technology beyond sharp rocks. They did it through social bonds, shared knowledge, and collective action. In a world designed to kill them, they survived through cooperation. Every Homo habilis that lived past childhood did so because dozens of other individuals helped them, fed them when they were young, protected them from predators, taught them survival skills, cared for them when injured. This might be Homo habilis's greatest legacy, not the tools, not being our ancestors, but proving that cooperation could overcome almost impossible odds. They were weak individually, but strong collectively. They turned their greatest vulnerability, their dependence on others, into their survival strategy. But even with all these social adaptations, the question remains, how did they last 700,000 years when everything was against them? The answer might be that they didn't just survive, they endured. There's a difference. Survival is making it through today. Endurance is making it through today knowing tomorrow will be just as bad and doing it anyway. So here's where the story of Homo habilis gets really weird. They didn't just disappear one day. They didn't get wiped out by a meteor or a supervolcano. They slowly, painfully faded away while watching other human species take over their world. Imagine being the last generation of your entire species, knowing you're watching the end of your kind. That's how Homo habilis went out. Not with a bang, but with a 700,000-year-long whimper. The fossil record shows something fascinating and depressing. Around 1.6 million years ago, Homo habilis populations started shrinking, not everywhere at once, but region by region, like lights going out across a continent. East Africa, where they'd thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, saw populations crash. Sites that had been occupied continuously suddenly go quiet. No more tools, no more bones, just absence. But here's the kicker. They didn't disappear because the environment got worse. In fact, around this time, Africa was going through a relatively stable climate period. The wild oscillations of earlier millennia had calmed down. Food was more predictable, water sources more reliable. By all measures, life should have gotten easier for Homo habilis. Instead, they started dying out. Why? Competition. Homo erectus had arrived, and they were basically Homo habilis's replacement model. Everything habilis could do, Erectus did better. Erectus stood 5 to 6 feet tall compared to habilis's 4 feet. Their brains were 50% larger. They had fire, sophisticated tools, and probably basic language. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight. It was a slow-motion extinction. The overlap period is particularly brutal when you really think about it. For about 500,000 years, Homo habilis and Homo erectus lived in the same places. They weren't separated by geography or time. They were neighbours. Homo habilis would have watched erectus using fire to cook food, making advanced tools, successfully hunting large prey. They would have understood on some level that these new humans were superior. That's got to mess with your head, watching your replacement literally living next door. New fossil evidence from 2024 suggests this overlap was even more direct than we thought. At sites like Olduvai Gorge, we find Homo habilis and Homo erectus fossils in the same geological layers, sometimes just meters apart. They weren't just in the same region, they were in the same valleys, drinking from the same streams, possibly competing for the same carcasses. Every day Homo habilis would have been reminded of their inadequacy. The tool evidence is particularly telling. In layers where both species are present, we find two distinct tool traditions: the primitive Oldowan tools of Homo habilis and the advanced Acheulean tools of Homo erectus. But here's what's heartbreaking: the Homo habilis tools don't improve. Even with advanced technology literally in front of them, they couldn't copy it, they couldn't learn. They were stuck with their simple choppers while watching erectus make symmetrical hand axes. It's like being stuck with a flip phone while everyone around you has smartphones, except the flip phone is keeping you alive and you literally cannot understand how the smartphone works despite seeing it every day. That's cognitive limitation at its most brutal. Having the example right there, but lacking the brain power to replicate it. The last Homo habilis populations probably survived in marginal areas where Homo erectus didn't bother to go. Dense forests where erectus's ground-adapted bodies were less advantageous, swamps where large body size was a liability, rocky highlands where resources were too scarce to support erectus's higher caloric needs. Homo habilis became refugees in their own homeland, pushed to the edges of survivable space. These final populations faced a genetic bottleneck that would have accelerated their decline. Small, isolated groups meant inbreeding. Inbreeding meant genetic defects. Genetic defects meant even lower survival rates. It's a downward spiral that's almost impossible to escape. Each generation would have been slightly less viable than the last, slowly accumulating harmful mutations with no way to flush them from the gene pool. The youngest confirmed Homo habilis fossil is about 1.4 million years old, found at Kubifora in Kenya. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. There might have been tiny populations hanging on in remote areas for thousands of years after that. The last Homo habilis might have died alone, the final member of a species that had endured for 700,000 years, with no one to even notice they were gone. But here's something nobody talks about. What if Homo habilis didn't completely disappear? What if some of them mixed with other human species? The genetics of early humans is incredibly messy. We know Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. We know different human species could produce viable offspring. So why not Homo habilis? Some researchers have suggested that certain primitive features that pop up in later human fossils might be holdovers from Homo habilis ancestry. A particularly small brain here, primitive tooth there, maybe habilis genes survived even if the species didn't. Maybe we all carry a tiny piece of these disaster humans in our DNA. It's speculative, but it's not impossible. The cultural impact of Homo habilis on later humans is clearer. Homo erectus didn't invent tool use from scratch. They inherited and improved on the older one tradition that habilis had developed. The concept of napping stones, of creating sharp edges, of using tools to process food, all of that started with habilis. Erectus just did it better. Every tool we've ever made, from hand axes to computers, can trace its conceptual lineage back to some Homo habilis figuring out that sharp rocks cut things. The social structures Homo habilis developed probably influenced later species too. Large group living, division of labor, care for the injured, food sharing, these weren't inevitable developments. Homo habilis proved they could work, providing a template for later humans to build on. Homo erectus didn't have to figure out group dynamics from scratch. They could see how habilis groups operated and improve on the model. But perhaps Homo habilis's greatest contribution was being a cautionary tale. They showed what happens when you're just barely smart enough to survive, but not smart enough to thrive. They were evolution's rough draft, full of potential, but lacking the refinement to truly succeed. Every human species that came after could look at habilis and think, we need to do better than that. The environmental data from Homo habilis's time period provided crucial information for later humans. 700,000 years of climate data encoded in the fossil sites where habilis lived and died. Patterns of drought and rainfall, volcanic eruptions, predator populations, all preserved in the geological record. Later humans inherited a massive database of environmental information paid for with Homo habilis blood. Think about it this way. Every Homo habilis that died from eating a poisonous plant was teaching future humans what not to eat. Everyone killed by a crocodile was mapping dangerous areas. Everyone who starved during a drought was recording climate patterns. They were unwitting scientists, gathering data through lethal trial and error. Their suffering became our species' early warning system. The technological stagnation of Homo habilis also taught an important lesson. Innovation matters. For nearly 1 million years, the Oldowan toolkit remained basically unchanged. Same choppers, same flakes, same hammerstones. No improvements, no innovations, no progress. Later, human species saw this and understood that technological advancement was necessary for survival. Standing still meant extinction. The Homo habilis story also demonstrates the importance of brain size, but not in the way you might think. They had bigger brains than Australopithecines, but still failed. This showed that brain size alone isn't enough. You need the right kind of brain development. Quality over quantity. Homo erectus didn't just have bigger brains than habilis. They had better organized brains with enhanced areas for planning, language, and social coordination. The demographic patterns of Homo habilis revealed the minimum viable population sizes for human species. Their groups of 70 to 85 individuals seemed to be right at the threshold. Smaller groups went extinct, larger groups split. This became the template for human social organization for millions of years. Even today, stable human communities tend towards similar sizes. We're still following rules established by Homo habilis's trial and error. Their dietary experiments, painful as they were, established the omnivorous pattern that would define humanity. Australopithecines were mostly vegetarian. Later humans were successful hunters. Homo habilis occupied the painful middle ground, proving that humans could survive on mixed diets, but also showing the dangers of scavenging. Their dental disasters from eating grit-contaminated food taught later humans the importance of food processing. The geographic distribution of Homo habilis also mapped out viable human habitat in Africa. Where habilis fossils are found, later humans thrived. Where habilis couldn't survive, neither could other early humans. They were the canaries in the evolutionary coal mine, testing environments with their lives. Their presence or absence became a map of habitability that guided human evolution for millions of years. But here's the really mind-blowing part. Homo habilis might have been necessary for our existence, not as direct ancestors, though they probably were, but as competition that drove other human species to evolve. Homo erectus might not have developed such large brains and advanced tools without the pressure of competing with habilis for resources. Evolutionary pressure requires competition, and habilis provided it, even if they were losing. The diseases that plagued Homo habilis probably accelerated human immune system evolution. Every pathogen that jumped from animals to habilis was a potential threat to other human species. But exposure to these diseases, even indirect exposure through shared environments, would have selected for individuals with better immune responses. Homo habilis was basically taking all the hits so later humans could develop immunity. Their physical weaknesses also highlighted what needed to improve. Small size, later humans got bigger. Weak bones, later humans developed more robust skeletons. Poor running ability, later humans became persistence hunters. Bad teeth, later humans developed food processing techniques. Every weakness of Homo habilis became a checklist for evolution to address in subsequent species. The social bonds Homo habilis developed in response to their weaknesses became the foundation of human cooperation. They proved that physically weak individuals could survive through social strength. This lesson resonated through human evolution. We're not the strongest species, or the fastest, or the toughest, but we're the most cooperative, and that started with Homo habilis figuring out that working together beat dying alone. Even their extinction pattern provided valuable information. The way Homo habilis gradually faded rather than disappeared suddenly showed that human species could coexist, compete, and slowly replace each other. This pattern would repeat with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other human species. Gradual replacement rather than sudden extinction became the norm for human evolution, a pattern first established with Homo habilis's long goodbye. The mystery of how Homo habilis survived for 700,000 years despite everything against them might have a simple answer. They survived because they had to. They were the bridge between ape and human, holding the evolutionary line while better adaptations developed. They were never meant to thrive. They were meant to endure just long enough to pass the torch. And pass it they did. Every human alive today exists because Homo habilis endured 700,000 years of hell. They suffered through predators, disease, starvation, and competition so that eventually, millions of years later, we could complain about Wi-Fi speeds and argue about TV shows. We owe our existence to these small, weak, disaster humans who somehow refuse to give up. That's the real tragedy and triumph of Homo habilis. They were just smart enough to know how much danger they were in, but not smart enough to effectively counter it. They could see death coming, but couldn't stop it. They could recognize better tools, but couldn't make them. They could observe other species succeeding, but couldn't replicate their success. They were trapped in an evolutionary uncanny valley, too human to be apes, too primitive to be successful humans. You want to know the craziest thing about Homo habilis? They basically invented suffering as a survival strategy and somehow made it work for longer than any other human species has managed to exist. And I mean that literally. They turned being terrible at everything into an evolutionary advantage. They were so bad at surviving that they accidentally became the foundation for all human evolution. Let me explain how being evolution's biggest losers made them the most important humans to ever live. New research from 2025 has completely changed how we think about Homo habilis. For decades, we thought they were just a failed experiment, an evolutionary dead end that barely mattered. Turns out they might have been the most important human species ever. Not because they were successful, but because they failed in exactly the right ways to push human evolution forward. Think about it like this. Every other human ancestor was either really good at one thing or decent at several things. Australopithecus afarensis, great at climbing, Paranthropus boisei, amazing at chewing tough plants. But Homo habilis, they were remarkably, consistently, almost impressively bad at everything, and that complete lack of specialization might have been genius. Because when you're bad at everything, you have to try everything. When you can't climb well enough to live in trees or run fast enough to escape on the ground, you have to find a third option. When you can't fight predators or properly hunt prey, you have to develop new strategies. Homo habilis was forced to innovate not because they were smart, but because they were desperate. This desperation-driven innovation created a feedback loop that would define human evolution. Being bad at physical tasks pushed them toward tool use. Tool use required bigger brains. Bigger brains needed more calories. More calories meant more dangerous scavenging. More dangerous scavenging required better group cooperation. Better cooperation needed complex communication. Complex communication required even bigger brains. Round and round it went, each failure driving the next adaptation. But here's what nobody expected. 2025 genetic studies on early human fossils have found something shocking, traces of what might be Homo habilis DNA in later human populations. Not direct genetic inheritance, but viral DNA. Let me explain, because this is wild. When Homo habilis got sick from various viruses, some of that viral DNA got incorporated into their genome. This is normal and happens to all species. But when habilis occasionally interbred with other early humans, they passed on these viral insertions. These ancient viral sequences acted like evolutionary accelerators. They increased genetic diversity in later human populations. They provided raw material for evolution to work with. Some researchers now think that exposure to Homo habilis' disease-ridden populations might have jump-started immune system evolution in Homo erectus and later humans. Homo habilis was basically a walking vaccination program for humanity. The tool tradition they started, the older one, seems primitive now, but it represented a cognitive revolution. For the first time, a species was modifying objects to solve future problems, not just using tools opportunistically like chimps do, but making tools in anticipation of need. That's abstract thinking. That's planning. That's the cognitive foundation that everything from agriculture to space travel would build on. Recent analysis of older one tools using new microscopic techniques has revealed something fascinating. The tools show evidence of being made by individuals with different skill levels. Some are expertly knapped with consistent flake patterns. Others look like someone was just randomly hitting rocks together. This suggests Homo habilis had teaching and learning, masters and apprentices. They had education, primitive but real. The stones they used tell another story. Isotope analysis shows some tools were made from rocks transported over 50 miles for a creature that could barely run through territory full of predators. Why? Because certain stones made better tools. They understood material properties, they had preferences, they made cost-benefit analyses. Is this rock worth risking my life to transport? That's complex decision-making. But perhaps their greatest innovation was something intangible, hope, or maybe stubbornness, or just the inability to know when to quit. Whatever you call it, Homo habilis developed the distinctly human trait of persisting despite overwhelming evidence that they should give up. Every other species that faced the challenges Homo habilis faced went extinct quickly. But habilis just kept going, generation after generation, refusing to acknowledge that they were doomed. This psychological trait, this refusal to accept defeat, might be their greatest gift to us. Modern humans face challenges that should paralyze us with despair: climate change, wars, pandemics, economic collapses. But we keep going, we persist, we endure. That's the Homo habilis in us, the part that says, yeah, everything is terrible and we're probably going to die, but let's try anyway. The group dynamics Homo habilis developed laid the groundwork for human civilization. They proved that large groups could work together despite individual differences. They showed that specialization within groups improved survival. They demonstrated that caring for non-productive members, the injured, the young, the old, could benefit the group long term. Every society that's ever existed builds on principles Homo habilis discovered through brutal trial and error. Their relationship with predators also changed the course of evolution. By being prey for so long, Homo habilis developed hypervigilance that became a core human trait. Our ability to detect patterns, to notice subtle environmental changes, to feel that something is wrong even when we can't explain why, that all comes from millions of years of being hunted. Homo habilis's fear became our intuition. The sites where Homo habilis lived and died became classrooms for later humans. Olduvai Gorge, Kubi Fora, Lake Turkana, these weren't just places where habilis fossils happened to be found. These were proving grounds where human evolution was tested and refined. Every fossil bed is a library of information about what worked and what didn't. Later, humans didn't have to repeat habilis's mistakes because the evidence was literally written in stone. Even their name, habilis, meaning handyman, has proven ironic in ways Louis Leakey never imagined. They weren't handy in the sense of being skilled, they were handy in the sense of being useful. Every aspect of their existence, including their failures, especially their failures, provided useful information for human evolution. They were evolution's crash test dummies, taking the hits so future humans could build safer vehicles. The climate chaos they endured prepared humanity for variability. Homo habilis lived through some of the most dramatic climate swings in Earth's history. They experienced ice ages and tropical periods, floods and droughts, volcanic winters and scorching summers. They survived it all barely, but they survived. This selected for humans who could adapt to anything, who could survive anywhere. That flexibility is why humans now live on every continent, in every climate, even in space. Their terrible teeth taught humans the importance of food processing. Every Homo habilis that died from dental infections was a lesson in the importance of cooking, grinding, and otherwise preparing food. Fire wasn't just about warmth and protection. It was about not dying from tooth decay at 17. The entire culinary tradition of humanity, from the first cooked meat to molecular gastronomy, exists because Homo habilis showed what happens when you don't process your food. The parasites and diseases that plagued Homo habilis became humanity's immunological boot camp. Every pathogen that jumped from animals to habilis was a potential pandemic for early humans. But exposure over hundreds of thousands of years allowed for evolutionary responses. Our immune system's complexity, its ability to remember and respond to thousands of different pathogens, was forged in the diseased bodies of Homo habilis. Their failed hunting attempts established the value of persistence hunting, a technique later humans would perfect. Homo habilis couldn't catch prey in a sprint, but their attempts to pursue animals, even unsuccessfully, showed that exhausting prey was possible. Homo erectus took this failed strategy and turned it into humanity's signature hunting technique. We became the terminators of the animal kingdom, slowly walking prey to death, because habilis showed it might work. The bones of Homo habilis, scarred and broken, told stories that shaped human mythology. Every culture has tales of monsters and heroes, struggles against impossible odds, caring for the weak, and sacrifice for the group. These aren't random stories, they're cultural memories of real experiences, encoded in myth and passed down through generations. The leopard that killed Homo habilis became the dragon of our fairy tales. Their group solidarity became our ideas of honour and loyalty. But here's the ultimate plot twist. Homo habilis might not be extinct, not in the way we traditionally think of extinction. Their physical form is gone, sure, but every human behaviour, from using tools to caring for our sick, from living in groups to teaching our young, carries the imprint of Homo habilis's desperate innovations. They didn't just contribute to our evolution, they became the template for human existence. Recent archaeological discoveries have found Oldowan tools in sites dating to 2.6 million years ago, before Homo habilis appeared in the fossil record. This means either habilis is older than we thought, or the tool tradition they're famous for was inherited from an even earlier ancestor. Either way, it shows that the Homo habilis story is still being written, still revealing surprises. Some researchers now argue that Homo habilis should be split into multiple species. The variation in fossils is too great for a single species. Maybe what we call Homo habilis was actually 3 or 4 different experiments in being barely human. If true, it makes their story even more remarkable. Multiple species, all struggling with the same basic problems, all contributing to the eventual emergence of successful humans. The final Homo habilis might have lived more recently than we think. Absence of fossils doesn't mean absence of species. Small populations in remote areas could have persisted for hundreds of thousands of years after the last fossil we've found. Somewhere in Africa, maybe as recently as 1 million years ago, the last Homo habilis might have watched the sun set, unaware they were the end of a 700,000-year story. Or maybe they knew, maybe that final Homo habilis understood on some level that their time was over. Maybe they looked at the Homo erectus camps with their fires and advanced tools and understood that the future belonged to them. Maybe they were okay with that. Maybe after 700,000 years of suffering, extinction was a relief. But extinction isn't really the end, is it? Every human alive carries the legacy of Homo habilis. When we use tools, we honour their innovation. When we care for our sick, we continue their compassion. When we persist despite impossible odds, we channel their stubborn refusal to quit. When we gather in groups for protection and companionship, we're following patterns they established through blood and suffering. Homo habilis proved that being human isn't about being strong or smart or fast. It's about enduring. It's about taking whatever horrible hand evolution deals you and playing it anyway. It's about facing a world designed to kill you and saying, not today, maybe tomorrow, probably tomorrow actually, but not today, and then saying the same thing tomorrow and the next day for 700,000 years. They were the worst humans at being human, but they were the first to be human at all. They took the leap from ape to human and paid for it with generations of suffering. They were evolution's rough draft, full of errors and corrections, crossed out sections and margin notes. But every masterpiece starts with a rough draft. Every success is built on a foundation of failures. So the next time you use a tool, any tool, from a hammer to a smartphone, think about the Homo habilis who figured out that sharp rocks cut things. When you help someone who's sick or injured, remember the Homo habilis who first decided that group survival mattered more than individual efficiency. When you face something that seems impossible and decide to try anyway, you're channeling the spirit of a species that faced impossible odds every single day for 700,000 years and kept going. Homo habilis, the worst time to have ever been human, the species that had everything stacked against them, the evolutionary disaster that shouldn't have survived 1,000 years but lasted 700,000. They were us, the first us, the worst us, but undeniably us. And in the end, that's all that mattered. They were human, terribly human, but human nonetheless. And because they endured, because they suffered, because they refused to quit, we exist. That's their legacy. Not the tools, not the fossils, not even the DNA. Their legacy is the simple fact that humans exist at all. Every person alive, all 8 billion of us, exist because Homo habilis proved that being barely human was enough, that surviving badly was better than not surviving at all. That endurance could overcome anything, even being nature's punching bag for 700,000 years. They were the worst humans ever, and they were perfect.